From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
$364 million. That's the fine former President Trump has been ordered to pay in New York's civil fraud suit against him. And he's barred from doing business in the state for 3 years. We'll discuss with former Watergate prosecutor Nick Akerman.
And Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny reported dead in an Arctic Russian prison. President Biden today laying the blame for his death on Vladimir Putin.
Putin had him poisoned. He had him arrested. He had him prosecuted for fabricated crimes. He sentenced him to prison. He was held in isolation. Even all that didn't stop him from calling out Putin's lies.
We'll speak with Angela Stent, author of Putin's World, and Leon Panetta, former U.S. Secretary of Defense, this hour. So, of course, Joe, that is how we began our day on this Friday with the news of the reported death of Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison. But we end the day with the news of a massive fine that former President Trump has been ordered to pay. Right. And we got a statement from his campaign. He says this decision is a complete and total shame. Yeah, this is the New York civil fraud trial, not to be confused with the criminal one. $364 million, Kaylee, just shy of what was being asked for. And the former president will not be able to do business in New York for 3 years. His two eldest sons, 2 years. Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, as you point out, this is the civil case in New York. There's also the one coming March 25th when the criminal trial, the first ever for a former president, will be beginning. So joining us now to discuss our top stories this evening are Bloomberg's Laura Davison and Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government. It is Friday after all, guys. Bear with me. But Laura, let's begin with you just on this news about the penalty the former president has to face here. This follows an $80+ million payment that he was ruled he had to make in the defamation case against E. Jean Carroll. Add on $50 million in legal fees. We know that his campaigns and those entities supporting him paid out in 2023. This is stacking up to be a pretty massive bill, and we're kind of just getting started when it comes to the criminal cases. Can he afford this?
Well, so this is an expensive year for sure. On his legal fees, paying his lawyers, the good news is for him is that he can pay that out of political action committee money. So it doesn't come from his personal coffers. But these judgments, those do come out of his own personal finances. He can't use donor money to pay for that. Mm-hmm. So, between the E. Jean Carroll and today's, judgment, we're looking, somewhere north of $400 million. He is and will appeal this ruling. But he does have to put a portion of it into escrow, basically, for safekeeping. Our Bloomberg billionaire estimates, have that he has somewhere around $600 million in cash. Mm-hmm. So, that's certainly enough to pay it, but would, certainly be a dent in his cash holdings. It sure is for someone many consider to be a billionaire, at least as he likes to say. You were reporting this week that with his cash burn rate, he could be out of money to pay attorneys by July. When you add that, he's got, another $23 million left to spend on lawyers. Where's he going to get the money from? So that's a real big question. He has, but he's paying about $25 million every 6 months, and that number could certainly go up this year just because of all of the trials that are ramping up, in the spring. So, sometime, potentially as early as, April or May, maybe closer to later in the summer, he's either going to have to raise more money from donors, which, that's tricky. Or he can go to the Republican National Committee and say, hey, can you pay my legal bills? They're also cash strapped. So it's going to be, if he is paying for this money out of, campaign cash writ large, that means there will be less money for Republicans running, up and down the ticket. Well, and of course, thinking about that this is happening in the middle of his presidential campaign, there is also the question of how this all changes the minds of voters. This is a civil case we're talking about, but our own polling has shown that if he were to be convicted of a felony in a criminal case, a lot of voters in swing states would turn against him. Does developments like today help him or hurt him more politically speaking, leaving the financing alone? You know, it really depends. So far, he has been able to benefit from his base of voters, you know, on these legal cases. He's already out fundraising on this decision already. So it could be a boon. But as we've seen in these swing states, you know, getting to the fall, that a small portion, but a portion of voters sort of flip, being, you know, I would vote for him if he were not convicted of a felony, to, oh, you know, I wouldn't actually vote for him. And that could be all the difference in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona.
Great, Laura, thank you. Laura Davison with us on Balance of Power. Elsewhere, few signs of movement for the Senate foreign aid bill for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, even as a group of House moderates proposed yet another plan to combine Israel and Ukraine funding here with border legislation. President Biden took aim at House Republicans today in his late scheduled news conference as they leave now for a 2-week recess. Here he is.
It's about time they step up, don't you think? Instead of going on a 2-week vacation. 2 weeks, they're walking away. 2 weeks. What are they thinking? My God, this is bizarre. And it's just reinforcing all the concern and almost, I won't say panic, but real concern about the United States being a reliable ally. This is outrageous.
Let's bring in Jack Fitzpatrick from Bloomberg Government, who specializes in the budget and appropriations process. Jack, I don't know why we're yelling today, but that was the message from the White House. When they come back, lawmakers, that is, they'll have 3 legislative days to figure out a way to avoid a government shutdown. Is that just too little?
Not technically too little, because they are going to be working the phones and negotiating, and they can hold negotiations and draft bills and rely on their staff that's based in D.C. to work out some of the details. And then they've got a couple days to hold a vote in the House. Mm-hmm. It seems that that is an assumption that the Senate would vote first, because the Senate comes in a bit earlier. So I've asked the members who are negotiating this, and they say it is tricky, but technically they can negotiate a deal to fund the government by that first deadline on March 1st, hold the vote in time, and that's what they need to be here in Washington for. It's not a well-timed recess, though.
Well, and perhaps they're going to want to get all of that out of the way first before they really tackle the issue of supplemental funding and aid for allies like Ukraine. We got the Plan D overnight. That's what we're calling it. This new plan that would provide more military aid specifically to our allies, including some border security measures. Is that going to be able to get over the line? And frankly, does the death of Alexei Navalny perhaps change the calculation of some members of Congress?
It may change the calculation. I mean, you see the statements from people who are opposed or skeptical about aid for Ukraine, and even the Matt Gaetz types are criticizing Putin before turning to explaining their position in opposition to this kind of bill. Now, this bill that just came out that was led by some moderate members, led by Brian Fitzpatrick, sort of centrist Republican, is probably not the answer, but it does represent a push by centrists who are saying, we are not waiting for leadership to decide an alternate route. We want to legislate. We have to go. We're not waiting for the slowest possible version of negotiations to carry forth. So it does represent some impatience and urgency from rank and file members around the middle of the spectrum.
Hard to tell how this is going to shake out in the next 2 weeks. Do you suspect that Joe Biden will deliver a State of the Union as scheduled just a couple of days after this shutdown might begin?
It is going to be a wild early March, because that's supposed to be March 7th. They've got the shutdown deadlines on March 1st and March 8th, and then he's supposed to send his next budget proposal for next year on the 11th. It's hard to keep to such a rapid schedule, but that is the plan, and it seems like there's a lot of heavy negotiating to do with all those major dates coming up.
And you got Super Tuesday on March 5th as well. It's just everybody buckle your seatbelts for that one. Our thanks to Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government. But of course, our other huge story today, the death of Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, and world leaders and politicians reacted to the news over the course of the day.
I am deeply saddened and concerned about the reports coming from Russia that Alexei Navalny is dead.
Whatever story they tell, let us be clear. Russia is responsible.
This is a tragic event. Mr. Putin is fully responsible.
I think it will be disastrous and a tragedy for human rights, democracy all around the globe.
His death in a Russian prison and the fixation and fear of one man only underscores the weakness and rot at the heart of the system that Putin has built.
Joining us now for more is Angela Stent, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of the book Putin's World. Angela, thank you so much for being with us this evening as we learn today of the reports that Alexei Navalny has indeed died. In his absence, what real opposition, resistance is left in Russia?
So Alexei Navalny, was the opposition leader in Russia. There is another opposition leader who is jailed in Russia too, Vladimir Putin, who's been sentenced to 25 years, but again, he's in prison. And most of the other opponents, vocal opponents of Putin, have left the country. And those opponents of Putin who remain in the country are pretty silent, because otherwise they will too be arrested and jailed. So really, this is a moment where we can understand that Putin has succeeded in silencing almost all opposition to him. They've even arrested tonight in Moscow and St. Petersburg and other places, people who silently stood in lines laying flowers at a memorial to the victims of the Gulag, but really for Alexei Navalny. So this is how bad it is in Russia today.
Angela, why did he return to Russia in January of 2021?
Because he felt that if he stayed outside of Russia, the opposition would wilt even further. He had a mission. He was determined to go back. He hoped that he would survive the Putin regime and then re-emerge as an opposition leader, although he understood that he might die in prison. And in the award-winning video, the Oscar-winning video film about him, he even said that. Yes, right. But he felt that as an opposition leader, it was his duty to be inside Russia, where Russians were still living, and not just to try and operate from abroad.
To what extent, Angela, does this perhaps embolden Vladimir Putin, especially if it's not met with a significant response from the West?
I think it does embolden him. I just watched a video of him today at a conference that they're having in Russia, and he looked rather pleased with himself. It's very hard to see what the West can do. I mean, we can have more sanctions, but there's a limit to what the West can do, really, to punish Russia for what's happened. And I think he now feels that, with his upcoming so-called election, when he hopes to be reelected by at least 80%, he rules supreme, and really nothing challenges him, because again, he squashed all of the opposition. The best thing that the U.S. could do would be for the U.S. Congress to vote for the assistance for Ukraine, because at least then the West can help Ukraine keep pushing back against Russian aggression against their country.
We heard from President Biden today in a late scheduled news conference, speaking specifically to Navalny's death from the White House. Here he is, Angela.
People across Russia and around the world are mourning Navalny today because he was so many things that Putin was not. He was brave, he was principled, he was dedicated to building a Russia where the rule of law existed and where it applied to everybody. Navalny believed in that Russia. He knew it was a cause worth fighting for, and obviously even dying for.
Remembering, Angela, that 3 years ago he told Vladimir Putin that there would be a draconian response, severe consequences. I believe the language that he used at the time. Today, looking at a number of options to hold Putin accountable. Are there any?
Well, there are more sanctions, except we have many sanctions against Russia. Putin is an indicted war criminal, and he's sanctioned. He cannot travel to many countries, although he can still travel to China and a number of other countries in the global south. So beyond the sanctions, there's not too much else we can do. And we have to remember that we, the U.S., we have 2 American journalists in prison in Russia, including Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal. We have the former Marine Paul Whelan, who's been jailed for several years in Russia. We have a former teacher at the former American school that's now being closed. So we have Americans in jail in Russia whom we're trying to get out. And so I'm sure that the State Department, the White House, also has to consider all of that when they think about how they're going to respond to Navalny's death.
Surely, and of course, against all of this, it's against the backdrop of what is about to be 8 days from now, the second anniversary of Russia's war in Ukraine. Angela, as we approach this anniversary, do you think we'll have a third? How much longer realistically does this go on, especially as you alluded to, if the U.S. does not provide additional support to Ukraine?
So the war will continue in 2024. It's a grinding, a very brutal war of attrition, but the Russians have made some gains recently. And again, if the U.S. does not provide the funding and the equipment, the weapons for Ukraine, it's going to be much more difficult for Ukraine. They do have money now from the European Union, but that's mainly for financial support. And some European countries are supplying them with advanced weapons. But we, the U.S., have the most advanced weapons. And without that, the future does not look good for Ukraine in the conduct of this war. And of course, if the Russians were to prevail, then I think the consequences for Europe and really for the transatlantic alliance will be very serious.
Angela, we're glad you could be with us today. Angela Stent of the Brookings Institution. We thank you. Coming up, we'll discuss the death of Alexei Navalny further with former U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Straight ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
He was committed to the vision that many in Russia had after the Berlin Wall fell, after the Soviet Union disunited, of a democratic Russia that would rejoin the world community as a trusted friend and a pillar. It has not happened, and in many ways, he was the last link to that noble effort.
That was former U.S. Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Week contributor Larry Summers speaking a bit earlier today, reflecting on the death of Alexei Navalny. Senator Ben Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, also reacted from the Munich Security Conference.
We're going to speak out about this. We're going to look for other ways that we can hold Mr. Putin accountable for these actions. And we'll work with the Biden administration and the international community to make it clear that this is outrageous. It violates all basic rights. And Mr. Navalny will not be silenced.
That's where we begin our conversation now with Leon Panetta, of course, the former Secretary of Defense, White House Chief of Staff, and former Director of the CIA, now Chair of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming to talk to us today on Bloomberg. I keep hearing the word accountability today. We heard it there from Ben Cardin. We certainly heard it from Joe Biden. What else possibly could we do right now to hold Vladimir Putin accountable?
Well, there's no question that the most important thing the United States could do right now is to pass the supplemental and pass the aid for Ukraine. It's been delayed too long. It's impacting on our credibility. The most important thing we could do is provide those funds to make clear that Putin will not succeed in Ukraine. That's probably the best way to get back at Putin.
Well, right now, sir, frankly, it doesn't look like there is a clear path for that aid to pass in the House of Representatives, and we won't know the answer to that for about 2 weeks. So are we not now looking at a Vladimir Putin who not only may be emboldened at home with the death and effective silencing of his most vocal opposition, and potentially emboldened abroad as well on signs that the U.S. support for Ukraine may be nearing its end?
Well, look, there's no question this is a pivotal moment. I think it was very important for the United States and NATO to come together to draw a line on Putin and make clear that he would not succeed in being able to destroy Ukrainian democracy. That's the right step to take. And it is important for the United States. It's important for our relationship with NATO to be able to now provide the additional military assistance. Well, let me tell you something. I think that President Biden, if he's blocked by the Congress, I think he ought to be looking for other ways to try to provide this aid to Ukraine. There cannot be an acceptance of the fact that Congress fails on this issue. That's not good enough. We can't just stand back and accept that kind of result. This is too important to our credibility to the world that we have to stand by our word that we would provide aid to Ukraine. So if Congress can't come forward, then I fully support the President of the United States finding other ways to provide both the weaponry and the money necessary to keep them in this war.
I suspect some of these conversations are happening right now in Munich. Secretary, you mentioned NATO, and there are a lot of European leaders who are asking questions about what might happen if Donald Trump is reelected. President Biden spoke earlier today in reaction to Donald Trump's comments from over the weekend about encouraging Russia to attack NATO countries who do not meet their commitments. We've reported that he's looking at a two-tiered NATO that might, in fact, pull or somehow revoke Article 5 from those countries that don't meet their spending goals. Here's what the president said today.
Let me be clear. This is an outrageous thing for a president to say. I can't fathom. From Truman on, they're rolling over in their graves hearing this. As long as I'm president, America stands by our sacred commitment to our NATO allies, as they have stood by their commitments to us repeatedly.
Mr. Secretary, what happens to the alliance if Donald Trump is reelected?
I don't think there's any question. I mean, Trump himself would basically say the same thing, that he would essentially undermine the NATO alliance. He talks about their contribution, but that's not the issue, very frankly. The issue is whether the United States is going to remain true to the alliance that Truman built, that Eisenhower relied on, that Ronald Reagan felt was very important to our security. And it is an alliance that remains critical to our ability to protect our national security. So, I don't honestly believe that this country wants to return to isolationism. We tried that once before World War II, and we paid a price for that isolationism in what happened during World War II. We don't have to repeat that same mistake, and I don't think we will. But to hear a presidential candidate make that kind of remark, indicate that Putin could somehow go ahead and invade a NATO country, it's not only disappointing, it's not only irresponsible, but it comes very close to the line of betraying what our country is all about.
Well, as we talk, Mr. Secretary, about the U.S. and its alliances, of course, the U.S. has to this point stood firmly by its ally, Israel, despite the operations they are undertaking in Gaza. We saw a hospital raided last night. There are questions about the operations they could undertake in Rafah, despite U.S. concern about making sure there are safeguards for civilians there. You told us a moment ago you think that the president should be doing more to ensure Ukraine gets the aid that it needs. Should the president also be doing more to keep Israel in check?
Look, there's no question that the president has to continue to pressure Netanyahu with regards to what's happening in Gaza. Now, there's a lot of moving parts, but the most important part is the ability to come to a deal that provides a ceasefire, I believe, for 5 to 6 weeks, if not more, that allows for humanitarian aid to go in, and that also provides for the exchange of the hostages. That is the most critical deal that needs to be made right now. There's a lot of other moving parts. We're obviously continuing attacks on the Houthis. We're obviously trying to get Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel. We're obviously trying to work on a Palestinian state for the future. But the most important thing right now is to cut that deal.
All right, Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your time this evening. That is former U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. Now, coming up, we'll turn back to affairs here at home and be joined by Nick Akerman, former U.S. Assistant Attorney, former Watergate prosecutor, to talk us through Trump's legal woes this week, including a demand now that he pay $364 million in New York. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Former President Donald Trump and his real estate company suffering a major blow in his civil fraud case in New York this afternoon. Judge Arthur Engoron ordering $364 million in penalties be paid and barring Trump from doing business in New York State for 3 years, his two sons for 2 years, writing in his ruling, quote, defendants are incapable of admitting the error of their ways. Instead, they adopt a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil posture that the evidence belies, alluding to the fact that he thinks there was no remorse on the part of the defendants. To take us through it all is Nick Akerman, former U.S. Assistant Attorney, who is joining us now. Nick, great to have you on the program. So we're talking well over $300 million, and then you add interest potentially on top of it, barring him from business for a period of years. He's likely to appeal, right? Will this stand?
He's going to appeal it. There's no question about it, but it is going to stand. This is a very detailed opinion that goes through all of the evidence on each of the defendants. It's not only just Donald Trump, his two sons, but it's also Alan Weisselberg. It's also this other fellow, McConney, who was involved with the Trump organization. They've all been basically found liable. They've all been fined. They've all been enjoined. And it goes in such minute detail into each of the various items that are at issue here. It's well over 100 pages. This is going to go up for appeal, as most cases normally do, but there is no way they are ever going to get this reversed.
Wow. This is quite a read here. To your point, about 100 pages. Mr. Akerman, the section refusal to admit error stands out here. The English poet Alexander Pope first declared, I read, to err is human, to forgive is divine. Defendants apparently are of a different mind. Their complete lack of contrition and remorse borders on pathological. Is this typical language?
I wouldn't say like it's typical language, but then again, these are not typical defendants. And it's very relevant in terms of the judge deciding that there needs to be an injunction in place to keep them from doing what they don't realize is wrong, and also to put in place a monitor and keep in place Barbara Jones, who has been overseeing the company for the last year. So there's a reason why he came to that conclusion. It's in order to justify the other remedies that he has issued in this opinion.
It's pretty incredible when you start tallying things up, Nick, considering this is one civil case we're talking about with hundreds of millions of dollars that he may have to pay, depending on how the appeal shakes out. There's the more than $80 million he was told to pay E. Jean Carroll in damages in her defamation case. You add attorney fees on top of that, and we have not even gotten to the criminal trials yet, but we will soon, March 25th. In the state of New York, the date in the Alvin Bragg case has now been set. And what does the legal defense do between now and then, hoping for a better outcome than he has seen in these civil cases?
Take a guilty plea. I just don't see how he's going to get anywhere in this Alvin Bragg case. We are looking at a case that's actually a very serious case. It involves election interference in 2016, where Donald Trump engaged in a scheme with his lawyer, Michael Cohen, and another individual, David Pecker, the owner of the National Enquirer, to basically keep information away from the voting public. If any of this information about Stormy Daniels or Karen McDougal had ever come out prior to the election, on top of what had already come out with respect to the Access Hollywood tape and the other numerous women that have come forward to claim abuse, I don't think he would have won. And so this case is extremely important, and it's very strong. I mean, from a prosecutor's standpoint, you've got two cooperating witnesses. You've got Michael Cohen and you've got David Pecker. They're both going to support each other. You've got a tape recording with Donald Trump talking to Michael Cohen about what they're going to do in terms of making these payments. And then you've got a lot of other ancillary witnesses who are going to corroborate all of this evidence. I mean, from a prosecutor standpoint, if someone handed me this case, it's a certain conviction. So he's not looking at a pretty picture going forward.
Kaylee reminds us how many cases we're actually talking about here. Mr. Akerman, a remarkable statistic from USA Today's ongoing review of Donald Trump's history with litigation. This is incredible to me. The paper's analysis finds at least 4,000 cases involving Donald Trump and his businesses. At least 70 have begun since Trump announced his candidacy about a year ago. Does that have any level of importance to a jury or a judge presiding over any of these cases?
Well, a jury or a judge is not going to hear any of that. I mean, they're not going to know about all these cases. I mean, some of these are other fraud schemes like Trump University, where he had to pay $25 million to settle that case before he assumed office of the presidency. So I mean, this guy has used litigation for years as a weapon against other people, as a way of getting out of monies that he owed to other people. And now he's finding himself at the other end of the stick here, not only with just civil litigation. And don't forget, with the civil litigation to appeal it, he's got to put up a very substantial bond, a cash bond, in order to be able to even appeal these cases. And then on top of that, you've got these criminal cases that are going to go one right after the other. What it looks like right now is that after this case in Manhattan, you're looking at the case in Washington, D.C. should be freed up. I would think the Supreme Court in the next couple of days is going to deny cert and deny an appeal on the immunity issue. And then after you're finished with the case in D.C., you've got the case in Florida, and then you've got the case in Georgia. So there's no rest here. This is just going to start moving forward like a juggernaut right to the end.
And during a presidential election cycle to boot, of course, there's someone on the other end of that, and that is the likely opponent Trump will face in the general election, at least at this point, President Biden. And we actually did get news related to the sitting president from the DOJ yesterday when a special counsel tasked with investigating the president's son, Hunter Biden, charged a man with lying to the FBI about he and his father's connections to Burisma. That man, Alexander Smirnov, they essentially said he falsified his statements. You, of course, prosecuted Watergate when there was questions around the behavior of a sitting president before. What does this do to the case against Joe Biden?
Well, there is no case against Joe Biden. I mean, this just was a trumped-up case to begin with. Keep in mind that the person who brought the case against this so-called informant was Mr. Weiss, who was the U.S. attorney appointed by Donald Trump in Delaware. He's the special counsel that wound up bringing this case. So it's not like anybody can claim that the Democrats went out and tried to undermine the evidence that the Republicans had. This was done by Mr. Weiss, who is a Republican and a Trump appointee. So this is pretty significant. It really kind of blows all the air out of whatever air there was in the case for impeaching Joe Biden. And it just kind of shows that the Republicans really have nothing here. There obviously is the indictment against Hunter Biden, which does not involve Joe Biden in any way. That's a case. It's going to go forward. And we'll see what happens. I know he's got defenses, and a jury will decide that case.
A veteran of the Watergate investigation, Nick Akerman, we thank you for the insights, as always, today on Bloomberg. Coming up, Donald Trump's team is calling the verdicts in his civil fraud trial an injustice and expected to appeal. We'll have the latest details, break it down with our political panel next. Rick and Jeannie are on the way in. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. A major legal setback for the Republican frontrunner. Judge Arthur Engoron's barring former President Trump from running any business in New York for 3 years and ordering $364 million in penalties plus interest. With us now, our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Chanzano, political science professor at Iona University. I think I have a sense of where you're both, how you both are going to feel about this. But Rick, it does seem like the walls are closing in from a legal standpoint on Donald Trump in a world where he's actually been turning this into a positive until now. Are we reaching a turning point here?
Yeah, very well could be. As you say, he's been able to raise money off of these early indictments successfully. And we have seen in the polling data, consistent throughout the targeted states that the Bloomberg survey has done, that a large majority, about 25 to 30% of the people who are on his ballot now, people who say they're supporting him, would be likely to move off of that ballot if he was ever convicted. Now, we didn't get into the details of convicted from a civil fine versus
right.
a criminal situation. So I have to believe that there will be people influenced by this conviction. And so I think that there is a vulnerability left in the cards for him. Plus, he's going to drain a lot of cash just by having to pay this fine. If he goes to try and appeal it, he still has to pay this fine. So he's going to lock up a lot of his capital at a time when, frankly, he's not doing particularly well right now financially.
Well, yeah, that's such a good point, because you add on this fine to the $80 million plus he's been ordered to pay E. Jean Carroll, add it to just the fees to pay his attorneys, which we know was $50 million plus in 2023. Bloomberg's own projections, given that burn rate, suggest he'll be running out of the money he has access to from the super PACs by July. And to Rick's point about how minds do begin to change when we actually start to see decisions, not just indictments or suits brought, Jeannie, is he going to run out of people to tap, potentially, to the same extent he was able to after he was initially indicted?
You know, I think that's possible. The reality is that there is no way you can look at a situation where somebody is facing 91 criminal indictments, a criminal trial starting in the end of March in New York, has to pay now E. Jean Carroll 1, E. Jean Carroll 2, now this Engoron case, it's civil case in New York. And that doesn't have a negative impact on your run for president. I mean, we just all have to take a step back and look. Yes, he has raised money off of making the case that these are all witch hunts. But at some point in these 6 or 7 states that Bloomberg has been polling that will decide this election, I'm hard-pressed to imagine, no matter who is donating to him, that there are more people who look at him now than in 2020 and say, gosh, he's the guy for the presidency. So, this is going to have a cumulative effect one way or another. And I think just the psychological, mental, physical impact on somebody defending themselves this much in courts while taking on the enormous task of running for president, how does that impact him as well? It is daunting if in the best of circumstances you add this to it. I think the impact is going to be incredibly negative in the long term.
Yeah. Well, we're having a general election conversation now. We haven't even gotten to South Carolina yet. And I wonder what you're thinking here, Rick, because this clearly won't catch up to him before then. The latest poll from Winthrop University this week showed him with a commanding lead, still some 30 points or more in South Carolina. Is he going to be the presumptive nominee in a couple weeks when we get to Super Tuesday?
Yeah, I think that South Carolina looks like a strong victory for Donald Trump. Whatever the campaign is that Nikki Haley's been waging there hasn't had an impact. Yeah. It's pretty much where she was when she got there 2 weeks ago in South Carolina for the election. So, at some point in time, reality will set in Nikki Haley's camp, although she just had a major fundraiser down in Texas, Harlan Crow, one of the sponsors. And so she's continuing to raise money. So the question is she really running to beat Donald Trump, or is she running to hang around the hoop long enough to see if any of these legal problems start to chip away at his level of support, or actually crater it to the point where even existing delegates that are on Donald Trump's side start looking for an exit ramp?
But, Rick, wouldn't that depend on what the RNC wants to do when we're talking about also right after South Carolina? Ronna McDaniel is going to be stepping down, could very well be replaced with a vocal Trump supporter from North Carolina, someone who denied the results of the 2020 election, and potentially his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, as co-chair to boot. I mean, in what world would the RNC choose to back someone else, even for all of his legal troubles?
Yeah, I don't think the RNC would be the genesis of a backlash to Donald Trump. As you say, he's moving very quickly to try and consolidate his power. And everybody does. When they are the presumptive nominee, the first thing they do is take over the RNC. And especially in a case like now where the RNC is virtually broke, right? And so if you're running for president and you need the RNC, you look at this and say, you know, we got to clean house and start all over again because whatever's been happening is not working. It's the delegates themselves who start to second guess who they're on. They're bound in most states to vote for the candidate that they were on the ballot for in the first ballot. If that candidate is still a candidate for president, they can be released if, for whatever reason, Donald Trump never makes it to the convention. And if he doesn't get enough delegates to actually win on the first ballot, then almost in every case, they become free agents. And if you're Nikki Haley, you're really twisting yourself up into a pretzel to try and devise a strategy to where that somehow benefits you.
All right, well, I guess we'll find out. We have 8 days to go until that South Carolina primary in her home state. Rick and Jeannie will be staying with us because coming up, President Biden visits East Palestine, Ohio, 1 year after the toxic train derailment in the area. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We continue to hold Norfolk Southern accountable, make sure they make your community whole now and in the future. And what they do not make whole, what they cannot make whole, what isn't made, the government will make whole. We have an obligation.
That was President Biden speaking moments ago in East Palestine, Ohio, 1 year after the toxic derailment of a Norfolk Southern freight train. Back with us now, our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. So, of course, Ohio, an interesting state, one that you maybe used to consider swing, now pretty firmly red. And it also, Jeannie, is significant in that it's going to be one of the states that potentially could decide the balance of the Senate. One of the most vulnerable Democrats, the chair of the Banking Committee, Sherrod Brown, is fighting to keep that seat. How hard is it going to be in Ohio to do that? And how much do you think the president deciding to visit the state today has to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, those are the states to watch, right? Ohio, Montana, West Virginia, the big three for Democrats, where there is a real fear that they could lose those seats and will be incredibly detrimental. And in fact, I would go so far as to say West Virginia is long gone already, and it's really Montana and Ohio that they're struggling to keep. And of course, Sherrod Brown, popular in Ohio, but still very vulnerable given how red the state is. You know, I am not convinced that President Biden visiting will do much to impact, the race. But I do think his visit is important. I think he should have been there long ago. I think he should be there now. And I think he should continue to visit. And I think his argument here that we're hearing about Norfolk Southern is the right argument. And he should be saying this about the cost of all groceries and everything. These companies are impacting how you are living, and I am your president, and I am here to hold them accountable. I'm doing my work, and so I am here to serve you. So I think the argument is right. He's got to keep making it, though.
You mentioned Sherrod Brown, the Senate race in Ohio. We've also got our eyes on maybe the other next closely watched Senate race that we're coming up on. That's Montana. Rick, we got the first commission poll for the Montana Senate race today, and it looks pretty darn good for the incumbent Jon Tester, up by 9 points over both Tim Sheehy and, I guess I'll mention, Congressman Matt Rosendale, who was a candidate for a week and is no longer because Donald Trump had a problem with that. Jon Tester cruising to victory here?
I think it's too early to tell. As Jeannie says, it's a red state. It's always going to be hard for Tester. Tester's an excellent candidate, right? Yeah. I mean, he's done great constituent service. He is the face of Montana in the United States Senate. And so he starts way ahead, right? I mean, he's got a base. She's a challenger. He's got no name ID in the state. Yeah. He's not campaigned. He's barely run a TV commercial. So this is a long way to go. And remember, I mean, most national politics is going to influence these Senate races. So Ohio's a great example. Montana's a great example. West Virginia's a great example. These are states that are going to be carried hard for Republicans. And so for a Democrat, even an incumbent, like Tester to blow through that cycle and try to make it about a state when a national campaign's going on. It's going to be very hard for these guys. And these are states that are going to vote Republican. And the idea that someone votes for Donald Trump in Colorado or in Ohio and Montana, and then a Democrat. Who are those people? I'm like, I don't know anybody who does that anymore.
Rick Davis would like to meet those people. Okay, so we've talked about Montana and Ohio, but we've both mentioned West Virginia, which, of course, is very likely to flip to a Republican because the incumbent Democrat, Joe Manchin, has decided he's not running for re-election. And, Jeannie, he also announced today he's not running for president either, despite all of that teasing about a potential third-party no-labels bid. He's not going to do it.
He is not going to do it. He is a big tease. You know, I was actually surprised he didn't wait this out longer. Joe Manchin really does like the spotlight, and this gave him some. But I think the writing was on the wall. That was not going to be a winning run for him, despite flirting, of course, with Mitt Romney the other day. And
Mitt Romney quickly shutting that down, by the way.
So, you know, I think it was the right move. And West Virginia, I think, is going to be a very, very big loss for Democrats. Not a surprise, but it's, you know, that one would be, I'd be stunned if Republicans didn't pick up that seat.
I just figured Joe Manchin was sore. Mitt Romney didn't want to be his running mate here, Rick. What's no labels do now? They have no one.
You know, too bad they couldn't run Mitt Romney and John Huntsman on the same ticket, but constitutionally you can't be both from the same state. So, you know, that would be the dream ticket, I assume, for no labels. Well, I think no labels has been out of luck for a long time, and they just continue to find that luck bucket is empty.
Isn't that something? Well, we'll see. They said they'd run someone by Super Tuesday, Kaylee. I guess it's not over yet. Our thanks to Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel, our closers on a Friday. Great to see you both. Have a great weekend. They'll be back with us for more next week. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter in the meantime on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Enjoy the long weekend, everyone. Happy President's Day. We'll see you back here on Tuesday. This is Bloomberg.